So in today's lecture, we're going to talk about ethics and the individual behavior change program. After viewing this presentation, you should be able to describe the responsibilities of behavior analyst as it relates to the development of behavior change programs. Given scenarios of the shock therapy or other aversive procedures to treat problem behaviors, you should be able to demonstrate under what conditions reinforcement or punishment is appropriate. Describe the advantages and disadvantages of electrical stimulation as a treatment for high-risk behaviors. Identify and discuss the issue using evidence from the Judge Rottenberg Center and other videos. Discuss the treatment efficacy of the aversive procedures used in the video and its effectiveness as a punisher. And given the actions by the UN, the facts of the current video, and this week's discussion board topic, write a brief recommendation to the President of the U.S. So what is our field's position on punishment? Basically, a good behavior analyst is going to recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible. But have we always been that way? Even in our book, Cooper, Heron, and Heward, that we use in several of our courses, they talk about punishment for self-injurious behavior. And they actually mentioned 46 studies that done in the field of applied behavior analysis in the treatment of self-injurious behavior with electric stimulation. They even identify it as one of the most rigorously researched and carefully applied procedures for implementing punishment by electric stimulation for self-inflicted blows to the head or the face. Many key leaders in our field were also involved in these early studies. Think about Brian Iwata, who is one of the leading experts on functional analysis of problem behavior. He was involved in the creation of SIBUS, which you guys read an article about this week. And he went on in a 1988 article in discussing his involvement in SIBUS and why he had participated. And he identified things like SIBUS or contingent application of aversive stimulation be treated as default technologies. And what he meant by that is it's one that you only rely on when every other method has failed. If you look though in Java and you do a search, you can see that even our field got away from this a bit because there's actually studies about electric shock used for treating stereotypy that was not self-injurious, and even one study related to an academic task where if they got the answer wrong, then they received a small electrical shock. So what do you think of electric shock? Think it's appropriate under any circumstance? Why or why not? It's important to realize that as a behavior analyst, you're responsible for all aspects of the behavior change program, from conceptualizing it to implementing it and ultimately to discontinuing it. Code 4.01 talks about conceptual consistency, meaning that we design behavior change programs that are conceptually consistent with behavior analytic principles. So I'm not going to design a behavior change program related to the importance of sensory integration, for example. Behavior analysts involve the client in the planning of and consent for behavior change programs. And this can actually be a tricky one because you can almost feel like, what are they going to consent to, or is that going to affect treatment in some way because they know exactly what procedures we're implementing? But that's exactly what informed consent is. They have to know the risk, they have to know what you're going to implement and what research says about it. So it is important that you have the consent of the client, and by client, of course, we mean the child, and then also the secondary clients like the parents and teachers, etc. Behavior analysts must tailor behavior change programs to the unique behaviors, environmental variables, assessment results, and goals of each client. And as part of this, we don't plagiarize other professionals' behavior change programs. As a teacher, I actually experience this with IEPs because other teachers would come down and want to look at my IEPs as an example. And then later I would see that they had the exact same goals and objectives. But as a behavior analyst, that would be against our professional codes. I also hear this from people who work in the insurance industry talking about how reports look very similar or goals look very similar across clients. So you want to make sure that you're tailoring it to the needs and strengths of the client. And you actually have to obtain their written approval before you make changes to the behavior change program. You want to be able to describe the objectives to the client, and you also want to describe to them the risks and the benefits from participating in the program. And then how you're going to get to meeting those goals and objectives. You also want to describe to the client, meaning the child, parents, sometimes the teacher in the school, depending on who's paying for it, the environmental conditions that are necessary for the behavior change program to be effective. So you don't want to say, I have all these goals, I have all these objectives, this is what I think the program will look like, this is what we're going to work towards. If you haven't talked to the parent and they're not willing to make those environmental changes, or you're not collaborating with them to figure out their goals and objectives also, then you're really setting yourself up for failure. So you want to make sure that you've had those conversations on the front end. You also want to handle environmental conditions that interfere with implementation as you go. So you may have to recommend a client go to another professional for assistance. So if they need occupational therapy or speech therapy or counseling or medical attention, if that is affecting the success of the program, then you want to make those recommendations. And then if it's hindering implementations, you want to seek to eliminate the environmental constraints or at least identify them in writing. You also, that's again where, and many of you may have had me or seen videos of me in the consultation course here, but that's also where you want to really use those collaboration and consultation skills to kind of work through some of those environmental changes. And part of that might also be looking at making sure that your procedures are appropriate for the environment. Here are the considerations regarding punishment procedures. So you want to make sure that you're relying on reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible, and that you're always including reinforcement if you do end up implementing punishment. And I strongly recommend that you work with somebody who has implemented punishment if it's something that you are implementing. Again, some of this may shift based on if it's severe self-injury or aggression. And again, Part D just kind of relates to that supervision, the need for supervision. And you want to modify the behavior change program if the punishment is not effective. So we don't want to keep punishing just for punishing's sake. If it's not working, then we need to come up with another procedure. And you always, even if it is working, make a plan to fade it out. You want to use the least restrictive procedures and explain these to the client and obtain consent to implement the modifications. You want to avoid harmful reinforcers. And what do we mean by that? You don't want to give a child candy 1,000 times a day because of the health concerns. Or you don't want to have the person sit in a chair all day because they need to move around and get exercise. When it's time to discontinue services, you establish understandable and objective criteria for the discontinuation of the program and describe them to the client. And you want to kind of set up ahead of time, when is that discontinuation going to occur? So is it when the child meets a certain level of objectives?